Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here to review 2003's Identity. So, this, of course, was like a no brainer for me to want to go into Mystery Month and kind of slap this one down on there because basically, I really enjoy this film. I really liked this film. And eventually, we get more and more creative as the film progresses, and it's just a really fun movie. I really enjoy it. How we just have this kind of who done it or this kind of murder kind of thing going on here, where every single one of these personalities were like, okay, like this guy seems much more shady than we were led to believe, and this girl was to be much more shady than we were led to believe, and then we continue on this pattern of having these people who are much more shadier than we thought we were to have originally thought. But not everybody gets a whole lot of time in the sun because eventually someone is to die fairly early on in this movie. So, so going into this film, we have technically two stories going on here. We have Malcolm River's story, which is a whole another ordeal, and then we have a group that is to all end up being forced to go into one hotel because of a flooding situation upon the roads, where like this kind of breaks down to eventually be like an Evil Dead scenario where everyone has to be forced to a hotel to not fight off a zombie monsterish thing, but eventually they are to seemingly have to all go and figure out like, okay, who is the murderer here? Who is killing who? It becomes a kind of whodunit situation where eventually they have to figure out who the murderer is. And if you've ever seen this movie, you'll of course completely know who the killer is because it eventually kind of lays it out. It's not a huge mystery of eventually who the killer is at the end of this film. So we'll get to that. But with that said, uh, where can you go to easily say that you've seen this film and be able to see it for absolutely free? Because a lot of people would like that. Because Google will probably tell you to go into Vudu and rent this, or Amazon and rent this. Where can you go to easily see these things? Well, if you go into a Google search, you can pop in these words Fox HD movies, and more than likely you'll get an app that comes up that says a logo that says Fox HD movies, but like the title will say something different. It'll say like play 1080p, some HD movie something. You can Google also this app called Letter C Movies, so C Movies, and you could basically be able to see almost everything. Um, with those combination of those two apps, because it seems that normally I can mostly see almost anything through those two combinations of stuff. Uh, there have also been other kind of random apps that I've kind of used over time, like TV Crush, which I don't think you'll be able to see this movie on that, but it's a suggestion for anybody who's to eventually kind of be looking for apps to eventually go ahead and find. I know if you Google search movie apps right now, you can probably find an app that has a logo that says Play HD something, and that basically is like the equivalent of Fox HD movies, and like you could basically watch that right now. More than likely, so many apps change, and it's harder to find them when, especially, they're a bootlegish like thing. So just kind of put that in mind when eventually in time you'll go through just Google Play and just search the word movie app to eventually find a app that basically is to eventually help you watch anything. So let's go on and let's talk about the not the kind of the main focus story that we have on here, which is all these people going and heading to this hotel. Because the whole Malcolm Rivers thing, that's kind of like a little side note. There's a little thing going on there, but like I think that story kind of ruins what is to eventually unfold here in this film. So, talking about these certain characters. So, we have John Cusack's character, who is to be Ed, who is to tie himself to Caroline Susan, um, who is to be this celebrity, and John Cusack is to be her driver. Uh, and also, it seems that Ed also has this weird, goofy backstory about him, which eventually that will play out within this movie. Rhodes, played by Ray Liotta, is to be someone who might be detecting things, but I don't know if he is exactly a detective. We'll get to that in the movie. Paris is to be played, of course, by Amanda Peet. Paris is to supposedly be this lady of the night who is eventually going to drive at night to eventually go and try to make it back to her orange plantation, weirdly enough. Sure. Larry is to, of course, be the guy who owns this hotel, so we are led to believe. Uh, Ginny and Lou are to be a couple that is to be married for who knows how long, because people might die in this film. Uh, Rhodes, Ray Liotta's character, is tied to Robert Main's character, who is to be played by Jake Busey, who is a convict. And eventually we are going to convict our way to say that we have seen this movie, and eventually we'll talk more about it. And also, we have the York family, who are going to eventually get a flat tire in this film, but dealing with a lot more than just a simple flat tire. And so, and we also have the side story, of course, going on with Malcolm Rivers eventually being a guy who is to get a last minute trial before he is to be sentenced to death. Because eventually we find Malcolm Rivers is to quite possibly have something that could convince a judge to change his sentencing, let's just say. So, anyways, let's get into that double five time territory. For anybody that has seen this movie before, let me know in the comments below how you felt about this film, especially if you watched it your first time around, and or maybe you're just finally going to catch this movie now. Like, it's a really actually great film. I enjoy it. Like, it really just keeps you like really interested, because eventually you see these people that they seem all well and good at first, but then eventually you find that there's like a pen drops and you're like, wait a minute, like this guy just seems way much more shadier than we were led to believe. And eventually you start to get these characters that start to seem to have these backstories that all of a sudden it's like, whoa, like, all right, this guy seems a lot more interesting than he was before. So, with that said, let's go into that double five time territory, because it's that customary time, yet again, to go into spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. Under 9 minutes, amazing, because normally it would take me like 10 to 15 to eventually talk about this in a cryptic like sense. So let's get down to business in spoiler sense. So we have in the very beginning of this movie, which I think, like every time we kind of cue up like Malcolm Rivers scenes, it feels like we're kind of giving things away. But I don't know. People could feel confused about it. People could kind of feel back and forthy about it. So Malcolm Rivers is to, of course, be quoting this weird quote about yesterday. I stood up the stairs to meet a man who wasn't there. Uh, I wish the man would go away, or it's something like that. It's some goofy thing like that. Uh, yeah, it's like, and that they keep quoting that throughout the movie. Like, it comes up like 2 to 3 times in this movie, maybe more than that. Um, Maybe it might be four. But so Malcolm Rivers is going and saying this poem, and so we have his doctor, Doctor Malik, who's talking to him, and like through this tape recorder like session, because Dr. Malcolm is playing it back, trying to make the assessment of whether Malcolm Rivers is completely sane or not. So eventually, Dr. Malik is desperately wanting to go and have a trial being made uh, before his death row sentence of Malcolm River is to be played out. So they have this guy eventually forcibly like made to this place. They have to kind of scramble this judge and scramble these lawyers and scramble all everybody to eventually get them down there to eventually witness Malcolm Rivers eventually going and performing whatever he is to perform here. So, like, we got technically that covered now. Let's get to the more interesting part, which, of course, is the hotel story. So, the very beginning of this film, we focus on the York family, George and Timmy, I believe, uh, and Alice, who are driving on to this road trip. So, all of a sudden, we have George, who is to, of course, get a flat tire, so they pull off to the side of the road to eventually find that there's a weird heel in their tire. So all of a sudden, we weirdly cue, for some weird, goofy reason, to Paris, who is just kind of looking for a lighter, and she's just like thumbing through her stuff. But I'm like, okay, why was that weird? Like, it seems like they cut to like some things that I just don't quite think are as important as they think they are. Right? I don't quite understand certain kind of scenes. Um, but it seems that also we get this interesting thing about Paris, where it seems she was to have gone on to do this gig, where evidently it was to be a guy's birthday, and then so she ended up pouring whipped cream upon his chest and putting candles into his chest, and then is to blow them out. Um, and so she is to, I guess, get paid to maybe go and slap this guy around or just do any kind of acts with this guy. So, pushing back to the more interesting stories. So, we have George, who is to, of course, be this guy who's to kind of rattle off this information, I guess, because this information is to eventually keep him calm. So, because all of a sudden, when he used to talk about every single bit of like car stuff, he just is like rattling off all this like these certain rules that I guess he had probably memorized. So George goes off to eventually go and get this flat tire unflattened by getting another tire out there. And so all of a sudden, his wife is to end up getting hit by what is to be Ed's car. And so now we have to change from perspective and or viewpoint and eventually focus on Ed's car. So Ed is going and driving this celebrity who is to kind of being a real annoyance, but like this girl honestly will not matter all that often, because like whatever she's to say is basically just like, I'm not listening. Mm-hmm. I don't care what's going on with her. Sadly enough, so because Caroline is to go and talk to her agent and just kind of bickering about how she basically just walked off set, and how basically she is to kind of strut in there and be like, man, I'm a really important actor, and this and that, and I should be treated like one, and so on and so. Eventually, Ed is to go and accidentally run over this woman because he's going in to try and find some battery in Caroline's Gucci bag. And Ed's like, where is it? Like, what is it? When is it? So Ed accidentally runs over Alice, and immediately he ends up scrambling out of the car because he's like, oh my god, like I couldn't see her. So George all of a sudden scrambles and is like, "Oh my god, my wife! Oh my god!" So, uh, so eventually, Caroline is definitely not getting out of the car because she's like, "Hey, like, if you get out of this car, like, you're gonna be at fault." And Ed's like, "I don't care." Like, freaking. So, Ed gets out there and tries to eventually figure out a way to help this woman. And so eventually what they decide to do is they eventually go and get this girl into her car, or into, I'm assuming, the York's car. So eventually they go to this motel, and so George is to eventually just kind of quickly make it through this motel door, and like, oh my god, my wife, she's bleeding. She's bleeding out. So they go and they sit this woman on this couch, and so now they're trying to figure out where the heck they're going. What are they going to do next? So all of a sudden, John is to go and eventually try and scramble to eventually make his way to this hospital, because Larry, who's the guy who owns this motel, is to say like, "Hey man, there's a hospital like 30 miles down the road. Like you can go and find it." Uh, and so Ed is to go and drive his way down this road to eventually seemingly bump into Paris, because Paris is to eventually have her car die, and so eventually she is to kind of get picked up by Ed, and Ed is eventually going to ask her like, well, hey, like, do you happen to have like a phone on you and everything like that, because eventually everyone is to be asked if they have a phone on them. Larry is to mention that the phone doesn't quite work, so eventually both Ed and Paris are to eventually drive uh, until eventually they have this huge uh, flood hole like thing where they eventually can't get any further. Eventually, that's why Paris eventually went and tried to turn around, but eventually her car died. So, yeah. And so, like, Paris had just been sitting in the rain. So, Ed eventually drives his car into this watery hole, because I guess they couldn't have driven around any part of this watery hold thing. So eventually that has Ed and Paris eventually bump into Ginny and Lou. And so uh, Ed is to stop them and just be like, hey, do you guys happen to have a cell phone? Like, do you guys, like, could we, like, kind of just go into your car, because my car is basically in a flooded hole right now? And so they're like, heck yeah, like, come on, just, like, and so Ginny's like, Lou, are you sure? And Lou's like, yeah, like, it's the right thing to do. And plus, it seems that, Paris is also a lady of the night, so why not just be, I guess, tempted weirdly by that? So, and plus, it seems like these people have nowhere to go anyways, so they're just like, well, I guess we're just gonna have to shack up at this motel. So, they go back to the motel, and Ginny and Lou have no cell phone on them, so they're forced to go back to the hotel. So eventually, that all of a sudden is to have us bump into Rhodes. Rhodes is to have a radio that doesn't quite work, and so Rhodes is to eventually bump into Ed, and Ed's like, "Hey, Rhodes, like, does your radio work?" And so eventually Rhodes is like, well, no, my radio doesn't work all that well. Like, cause like the storm, like there's problems with the storm. We have like Larry, who's to also mention, it's like, well, yeah, like my phone doesn't work because of the storm, because of the rain. Like it ends up having like the worst reception eventually once it's raining out. So I'm like, okay, not really quite buying all that, but like we end up having so many horror movies that eventually have to convince us that like mechanical things just bizarrely can't work for this one specific night for whatever. Like, hey man, Wi-Fi just died for whatever reason. Yeah, my phone battery just conveniently died, and now there's no way for us to eventually seek out help. How convenient. No bars anywhere. Like, um Caroline is to eventually try and make her way through this complex, this hotel complex, trying to find bars in her phone, and she ends up grabbing this shower curtain, putting it over her head, and starts going through the entire complex to eventually try and find uh, a signal, but she has difficulty doing so. So, but we'll get to that. So, what ends up happening is everybody is to eventually be forced to come on down because they're the next contestants on. They're gonna have to rent a room. So Rhodes is to eventually tell Larry, "Hey, I got a convict here," and so they're have like Larry and Rhodes is gonna have to figure out where that this convict can eventually be kind of cuffed to something, whether it's to be a heater or radiator or whichever. So Larry has mentioned that the furniture is to be crap, but if anything, he could probably go and cuff him to this toilet, which eventually we'll find out later that that won't work all that well because evidently this toilet is to be a really crappy toilet, as well as of course anything would in this film. Plus, it gives it that extra mystery of things that eventually it seems that even Busey's character is eventually going to get out and give you suspicions of who the murderer is. So, uh, so now we go further on into this, and so now that it seems like we do not have the ability of hospital here, Ed is to now have to just try to figure out how badly Alice's injury is. Alice York, of course, of the York family. So Ed is to now have to look at Alice's wound, and so evidently it's a cut on the neck. So Ed is like, well, do any of you guys have like sewing things? Do you guys have anything like that here? And so Ed eventually asks Rhodes, and Rhodes is like, no, like all I have is like a band aid and like first aid. And so it seems that Larry is to have a sewing thing for Ed to use. And so weirdly, we have this like this sewing thing that I guess is to not exactly be like it's to be this weird, goofy looking color, but it doesn't really matter. It's to do the job. So eventually, Ed is to ask Rhodes, like, well, hey, can you like kind of double check and kind of give me a kind of a second opinion about whether or not I'm like doing the like this whole thing correctly, where it's like I have a good like sewing thing into this woman. And if I were to have been Rhodes, I'm like, dude, I'm not a freaking doctor. Like, I'm a freaking like I'm a police officer. What do you expect me to do? So So we also have at some point where eventually Ed is to ask Rhodes about that radio, and it's like, what? Do you want him on the radio like every like 5 minutes? Like come on, like if the radio doesn't work, like give it possibly like an hour and maybe see if it works again. So and eventually Ed is to just say like, well, hey, how about we trade off on the radio? Like you take the radio once, I take the radio once, and like, and Rhodes is like, how about we don't? Like, how about I just handle the radio? And eventually Rhodes is to go and check up on the radio and eventually come back and say that it's worse. So eventually, we have uh, uh, we eventually have Caroline, like I said, who ends up going and trying to find bars. And so eventually, Ed is to go and try and figure out where Caroline had head. And all of a sudden, Ed is starting to find shower curtain things, like shower curtain attachment things. So Ed starts to follow the shower curtain attachments. And so that leads him to this laundromat like room where all of a sudden he's starting to hear this huge clunking that is to be in one of the dryers. So Ed eventually starts going and checking the dryers to eventually find Caroline's head and clothes within one of the dryers, and so both Larry and Rhodes eventually go into this room because we also end up finding out that uh, that Robert Maine, who is Jake Busey's character, is also gone missing. Because eventually Rhodes is to go back into the room to eventually find that Busey's character had broken out of this toilet and is now seemingly running free. So now that we have like Ed, who's to see a head here. We have Ed kind of second guessing uh, what Rhodes is doing because now we end up finding out that Ed had previously been a detective, and so now that Busey is on the loose, Busey's character, now they're gonna go and have both Ed and Rhodes just kind of team up together to try and find him. And so eventually Paris is to ask Ed, like, well, hey, like, you're a police officer? Well, what happened? Like, what caused you to eventually just stop being a police officer? And so Ed was to have this whole backstory where at one point in time, I guess he was to be a negotiator, where eventually he was to be sent in uh, against one woman who is to eventually, like, I guess, throw herself off some building. And so Ed was to be the negotiator to stop her from doing that. So eventually, Ed is trying to talk to this woman and just kind of calm her down. And so this woman is to eventually ask Ed, like, well, what would be the one thing that would probably keep me off of jumping off this ledge? And it seemed that Ed had a second's hesitation, and that was all that this girl needed to eventually decide to jump off this ledge. So eventually, after that, Ed uh, started having problems with him being a detective. It seemed like things were just going seemingly worse and worse to where all of a sudden Ed was starting to get blackouts or was just having certain kind of problems. And so he just eventually left the force and had like medical leave for a good long while. So until eventually like he just no longer wanted to be a cop anymore and he just left. Uh, so now it's funny, like, that we don't have Ed going and doing any blackouts during this point in time, right? Convenient, right? Anyways, so, uh, So eventually, Ed and Rhodes are eventually combining forces to go and try to figure out where Busey is, and so it seems that eventually we end up finding out that uh, oh, one thing that I want to also mention when they were to go and pick through Caroline's head, so to speak, they end up finding a they Core, you get a billion freaking scam freaking calls all day freaking long. You get like three or four of them. No matter how many times you could block phone numbers, whatever. Like there's just another one that crops up some other reason. But pushing on. So Caroline with her head had the number 10 on it, and so there's people that are kind of confused when they see this because they're like, wait a minute, this wasn't even her room. Why does this say 10 on it? It doesn't make sense. And so the more and more bodies that we start to see pile up, eventually we start to see that every single one of these are to have this attachment of number onto them. So more than likely, I probably won't get this like perfectly to the numbered notch of whatever, but we'll try to do our best here. So so eventually we push on. So eventually Busey is to be uh, going and running like seemingly. Jesus, good God! I'm just trying to do a review here. Like, not only do you get the call, but then you also get the voicemail because they gotta leave a voicemail just saying like, "Hey, since you completely like whatever, it's an automated thing. They can't like whatever." Anyways, pushing on. So, uh, we eventually get Busey, who is to seemingly be running away from this complex, to eventually find some other like place, and so Busey is to go through and find this one establishment and go to this one, um, like break into this one place to eventually find out while he's looking out the window that weirdly he's still connected to this hotel, and he's like, oh crap, because eventually both Ed and Rhodes are to eventually find him and start beating him up so that way they can go and tie him to a chair and watch over him. So uh, Larry is just kind of concerned that Busey's character is to be in this diner because eventually Larry is to have his own secret. So eventually Ed and Rhodes are just kind of uh, questioning Robert Maine to just kind of ask him certain questions about what's kind of going on here, about whether or not he possibly killed people, and so on and so forth. So, uh, so eventually it gets down to Paris making her way into this room also, and because eventually we find that because it seems that both Paris and Larry are having these like issues because Larry knows that Paris is to be this kind of hoe. So it seems that they kind of conflict with one another. So how this ends up eventually kind of rolling out is eventually both Ed and Rhodes are to eventually leave this place to have kind of Larry watch over this guy. And so I want to try to. So Robert is to eventually tell Larry, it's like, well, hey, it seems like you have a really good secret that you're kind of holding off. It's like, well, uh, like, man, like, how about you go and you tell me your secret because I'll tell you mine. I got a real good, juicy secret. So, Because eventually we end up finding out that Ray Liotta's character was to have gone and killed the police officer that was driving these two convicts to, I guess, a alternate prison. And so Ray Liotta ended up putting on the cop clothes. And so Busey was asking Ray Liotta's character, it's like, well, what am I going to wear? It's like, you're already wearing it. So he ends up closing the door on him and kind of tossing the body into the trunk. So, because we end up finding this like blood spatter in the back of this guy's back, and when he ends up kind of putting this blazer back on him, like Ray Liotta, we end up seeing that. So it's like, okay, like why does he have an injury on his back? That just seems kind of weird. But then eventually it kind of comes to tell us that that Ray Liotta's character just took this clothes. Rhodes just took these clothes. So now what ends up kind of playing out is that Larry ends up also leaving to eventually have Ed and Rhodes in Paris and Larry all come back to eventually find Robert Main's character, Jake Busey's character, dead with a bat into his mouth. And of course, we have him, I think, be number 8, because I think number 9 was to, of course, be Lou. Because Lou and Ginny go into the room, and so Ginny is to confess to Lou that she actually isn't pregnant, and so the whole reason why they were to have gotten married was all a lie. And so Ginny only got married to Lou because it seemed that Lou was going to eventually go with someone else. And so Ginny came up with some reason for Lou to marry her. And Lou was like, dude, I ain't going on with any other girl. Like, if anything, there were some girls that lied to you about what had happened. And so, like, I've never been with anybody ever, so I don't know what you're talking about. So, while Lou is to all of a sudden kind of, I guess, because we don't see this and we just kind of hear the noises of stuff, Lou is eventually going and to ask, like, hey, what are you doing here? And then all of a sudden, Lou is desperately calling for Ginny for her to open this door, and she won't. Like, Lou is desperately trying to smack into this door, and Gina is to just naturally assume that Lou is only saying this just because, like, he is still upset because she didn't hear what Lou had said before. So, eventually Ginny, now that it seemed that Lou had gotten really quiet, Ginny decides to open this door to find Lou dead. And of course, he is to be 9. And weirdly enough, like, the door that was to be 6 had broken to eventually be 9. So when eventually people were to go and find Lou dead, they're like, hey, maybe it's just a coincidence because they adjusted the door to say 9 on it, so maybe it is to be the 9 room. So then they eventually go and they find Busey, and he's dead. I think he is to be 8. And so eventually now we have Ed and we have Rhodes, who's accusing Larry of killing Robert Main's character. And so Larry is to eventually go and grab Paris and kind of like hold her hostage. He's like, hey, I'm not going to prison. Like, I didn't do anything. And so all of a sudden we end up finding out that there are bodies in this freezer of this diner, and so bodies start falling out. So now they go and they tie up Larry, and so now Larry is to confess like what eventually had happened, that Larry was to have lost all his money at this casino, And so Larry eventually goes on to make it to this hotel where this previous owner had coincidentally died uh, when Larry was to make it to this hotel. And so Larry just decided, well, like, I guess I'll just basically just take this guy's hotel without anybody knowing. And like eventually nobody really came for uh, the other Larry, and basically Larry just assumed to just toss this guy in the freezer just to preserve him until his family came, which they never did. So supposedly, so now like Larry is to not exactly uh like Larry, I guess, is to kind of get away with this seemingly, because eventually Larry goes and tries to go into this truck and tries to make a break for it, but when eventually he makes a break for it, he accidentally runs over George York. So eventually, now that George is now dead, uh, we are to eventually kind of move on to the next death. So eventually, the next death is to happen when they are to go, and Ed is to check on Alice to eventually find um, her dead, and she is to, of course, have a keychain next to her that, of course, is to, I think, be uh, where are we at now? Because I think Alice is 8, and I think George eventually dies after that, so that's 7. So my numbers might be off, but so pushing on. So we eventually go, and now everybody's to just kind of stay in this one room, or just kind of all stay together, because they're thinking that that could be the best way that everyone eventually could stay alive, is if they all stay in one room. But eventually it seems that people are to seemingly continue to separate. And so even when Ed is to tell Paris to just kind of like, well, stay with everybody, it seems that eventually she separates with people. And so so pushing on. So eventually there is to be a spot where eventually Gina is to want to decide to go on and with Timmy go and find help. So they end up going and finding help to eventually find themselves in a car explosion. And so, weirdly enough, they don't actually find any bodies in this car explosion. Uh, like, I don't even think they end up finding a keychain in this car, but so. But weirdly, there is like no body left here, so it's just like, okay, what the heck even happened? Or maybe they did eventually find some keychain or whichever, but it's so like it's really just getting confusing at this point. So eventually they go and they pull away the truck that is to now have run over George, and they find the keychain on George to eventually say his number. And so they're like, okay, like, so everybody like is to die in a certain order, and no matter what, everyone is to get a keychain, and so that says their number of their death. And so Paris is just like, oh my god, like, how is this all happening now? Because there's no way that anyone was going to know that George was going to die. um, like, there is no way that anybody would have known that this guy would have gotten ran over. So eventually Paris is getting everybody left, and she's wanting to figure out if there's all a connection weirdly between all of them. And so eventually Paris is to start asking people like, hey, like where were you going, where were you born, and so on and so forth. And so it seems that they couldn't quite figure out what the connection is between all of them, but then eventually they figure out that their birthday is coming up soon, because Paris is to mention that her birthday is coming up soon and she's going to turn 30. And so the people is just like, well, hey, like, your birthday's coming up soon, my birthday's coming up soon. And I'm like, yeah, my birthday's coming up soon too. So all of a sudden Larry's to figure out that every single person's birthday is all the same here, and all the people who had already died, same birthday. And so they're like, how is it that that's possible? Like, that's like a 1 in a billion shot kind of thing. And so they're trying to put these pieces together. So all of a sudden we end up getting the one spot where Ed is to eventually go on and supposedly have had this blackout, and is to now be in front of Dr. Malik and all these judges and lawyers and whatever. And so Dr. Malik is to talk to Ed and just be like, well, hey, uh, who are you? What's your story? And so eventually Ed is to mention that he was to have gone off and drive this one celebrity and had made it to this hotel, but he's just kind of confused how he is now here. And so Dr. Malik tries to explain that Ed is to be some personality in some schizophrenic character, and that Dr. Malik helps Ed understand, or maybe barely understand, that every single one of uh, Malcolm's personalities are all having to combine all together in one seemingly environment in Malcolm's mind to eventually confront one another. And supposedly, while that's to play out, eventually all these personalities are one by one eventually going to die off for one reason or another. So, until whatever is to be the last remaining personality is to come out of this, and hopefully it's not going to be the murderous personality. So eventually Ed is to go and look in a mirror to see uh, that there is to be a face that isn't exactly his. And so Ed's like, who am I? Like, what am I? Like, what? Where's my face? This isn't my face, and so on and so forth. So, but eventually Ed slips back into this hotel world where it seems like no one can leave. So eventually how this is to start to play out is, now we have to come up with some other kind of culprit. If we don't have Robert Maine now, who's the convict, now we eventually have to latch on to see who the actual villain is here. And so reasonably we had the assumption that Ed was to eventually kind of scramble through parts of this hotel to eventually find there were like several knives that have these little cases on them, and one of the knives in one of these cases were missing. So eventually we have Larry, who ends up getting like, I don't remember how exactly Larry dies, but we have Larry who eventually gets killed off here. So, God, I don't know how Larry died, because it really, like, it seems to not. I don't think he has like a real unique death in my mind. Uh, but anyways, eventually Larry, I think, is to eventually have gotten uh like stabbed, or he's to like get killed some way or another. I don't know. I don't think it really matters. It doesn't matter. It's not a big thing. Um, but eventually, we have it to where now Paris is to go off and is to eventually find uh, the trunk that has the police officer inside of it. And then she makes the realization that Rhodes is to actually be the convict and not the police officer. So eventually, Paris is to go and try to tell Ed what's going on. And eventually, Ed is just kind of like tell her, like, hey, well, I'm going to go and I'll take care of this. So eventually Ed and Rhodes are to eventually have a shootout, and both of them are to kill one another. And so this all of a sudden leaves Paris to be left alive or left last. So now we have it to where seemingly Paris is to be the only personality left in in Malcolm's body, and so we have it to where this judge is having this difficult decision of eventually putting this guy to death row if he still has a personality within him. So eventually they just, I guess, just cart him off as some unsane person, and so they eventually are driving him away to have Malcolm eventually go on and uh, like make it to some hospital where he's to get treatment. And so Paris is driving off to make it to her orange farm, and so Paris is going and doing some farming to all of a sudden have Timothy's character just appear and is to go and take this gardening tool and kill Paris with this gardening tool. And so since Paris and Timmy are having this inner turmoil between one another, all of a sudden Dr. Malcolm is asking or Dr. Malik is asking Malcolm what's going on, like, how can I help you, kind of thing. We end up having it to where the murderous personality is to have killed off Paris and is to be the only one left. And so all of a sudden, the murderous personality goes and chokes out Dr. Malik. And I guess it eventually escaped this whole scenario, which I guess eventually is to seem that there is going to eventually be a sequel here, which I don't think there's ever going to be one. I guess once you really just have this idea and you have it out there, I don't think there's ever really going to be a sequel out of this. So it kind of has this like Fight Club kind of approach to it, to where all of a sudden we find that really this whole second story is just an imaginary play out of things. And so really that's just how everything eventually just goes on. So with that said, I think that's all that I want to say about this movie. It still bothers me that I don't know how exactly where he died. I don't think it really, like, it might not. I might have to like figure it out, but still, I don't want to have to pause this and have to figure it out. So with that said, I am going to get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how Larry died, because it probably won't matter to me after this second of me being finished with this. But I just, like, I got a bulk of what all happens. I had to play out the whole thing all in my head. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, buddy. Bye, buddy.